In previous videos in this series, I have unfortunately gotten a couple of names wrong regarding the Eldari Council. So, I went ahead and spent a lot of time researching this very specific topic just for this video, so I would never make this mistake again, and kind of fell down a rabbit hole. This is the nearly full family tree of the Grimm dynasty, the family that has, for the majority of history, been in charge of this nation. I'm going to start this video by correcting a few names and information, so you know what I'm talking about in the future. Victus Grimm is the man who defeated the Orcs and the Porians near the beginning of this game, from the first episode that I covered. He is in fact still alive, and will be a large part of this next story. Victus has two brothers, Lumnar Grimm and Silenus Grimm, Lumnar being the more important here for this story, but Silenus will come back up later on. During the events of this video, Lunan Grimm, the son of Lumnar, is either not born yet or is a small child, so he probably won't be brought up until a later video. Going back to that rabbit hole I discussed falling down earlier, I wanted to build out this tree so I never made another mistake regarding the names of these very important characters again. And I came across something very strange. In the far future of the game of Inkunzi, we come to a point where it is unclear who the heir of the Grimm dynasty's holdings are at the end of Project Inkunzi. There are three options that I discovered, and each have their problems, but we'll come back to this chart again when the time is right. During the events of the previous videos in this series, in the far west, the clans of Rocolia were broken. They would fight each other constantly for control, but eventually, one man stood out. A man named Azulis united all of the Rocolian clans under his banner for the first time in history. Azulis was in possession of a bunch of clay tablets that laid out the Rocolian prophecy. The tablets described a man who united the Rocolian tribes after many years of brutal conflict, and that he would use his united Rocolian clan to then conquer the world and find the cure for death, which was described to be somewhere out in the east. Around the time of his victory, reports of men crossing the Rocolian mountain range became more and more common. Eventually, some of these unfortunate explorers were captured and information was obtained from them. They described a large and wealthy empire to the east, full of riches, and ruled by a cult of priests that worshipped the moon. Azulis began to see the signs of the next parts of his prophecy coming true, and announced the great campaign to his warriors and his commanders. Before long, they would set off east with the largest army ever assembled at this point of the game. Azulis split his army into three groups. He would go directly east over the mountains, and discovered the tin mining colony of Lorethil. He sent his second army south into the tribes of the Lizardmen, and his third army accompanied him west, but then went south down to Langmaskust. These two generals that accompany him would become very important later on in the game, but just know the two most important names of them are Jacobus and Rickar. It's unknown whether it was Jacobus or Rickar's army that moved into the Lizardmen. They were very successful. They raided and burned almost everything in their path. The Lizardmen were essentially unable to put up any sort of fight, and obviously were completely unaware of the danger that had just been thrust upon them. It was only when the Rocolians encountered the Lizardmen tribe of Thixi where they actually put up a minor defense, but eventually were also destroyed. The leader of Thixi would eventually be captured, and the Rocolians admired his strength. He would later be put in charge of a Lizardmen vassal state. Azulis' other commander made his way to Langmaskust, and would finally encounter the first Eldari garrison. Caught completely off guard, they were totally destroyed, and the survivors slowly made their way back south. Azulus himself made his way to Loreth Hill, where there was no real Eldari garrison, and Azulus had no issue pillaging the country. After the destruction, nearly nothing was left of the rich tin mining colony, and the territory would end up being almost entirely depopulated. Azulus eventually made his way south and moved into Palmerstad, where another Eldari army awaited them, semi-aware of the situation. Azulus attacked them in the city of Palm, but a stalemate occurred. The Eldari army began to take massive losses defending the city, but refused to hand it over. It wasn't until all three Ricolian armies regrouped outside of the city and attacked it a second time, before they were able to out the Eldari army. Phase 1 of Azulus' attack plan was complete. After suddenly crossing the border, attacking all of his new enemies with surprise, and destroying garrisons that posed the largest immediate threat. Instead of setting up in the city of Palm, a large camp was built in the hills outside of the city, where Azulus would now use as a base of operations for the next stages of the war. He also needed to figure out how to govern all of this new territory that he had suddenly acquired. After discussing with his generals, they brought him some high-ranking people from each tribe they had conquered, and divided them into two new bodies. Laesmat Nukamu of the Lizardmen, now led by the old chief of Thixi, and Stomwe House, commanded by one of his generals, Jacobus. So far, Azulus' plan was going perfectly, and to those who were caught up in his invasion, it seemed like nothing could stop him and his colossal army. This is all happening during the Porian Revolt, which was put down during Azulus' rampage in the north. The Eldari Council now moved from one crisis to another. Information about what was actually happening was slow to reach the capital city of Stendari, but eventually, soldiers, farmers, miners, all sorts of refugees began to trickle into the city. The council went into a state of panic after confirming reports of what they had heard. Huge hordes of half-man, half-horse rampaging through the hillside of their newly acquired and very valuable territory frightened them all to the core. The Eldari army had been severely weakened after the surprise attacks at their western garrisons and after dealing with the Porian Revolt. From what they had heard, this didn't sound like any battle they could win with soldiers. Victus Grimm eventually decided that the only way to find some sort of way out of this was to go and speak with the warlord himself. He decided that it was important to make his nation look peaceful and friendly, to both mitigate the possibility of more crimes against his people, and to possibly lure the Ricolian army into some sort of trap if they did not believe there was any danger there. Victus decides to leave with only a small contingent of soldiers, and more importantly, a large group of moon priests. Maybe Victus could convert him to the moon faith and avoid even more bloodshed. Before he leaves, he names his brother Lumnar, a very important figure for the future of Inkunzi, in charge of his seat on the council while he is gone, and names him his heir if he were to die. As Victus and his envoy found themselves within Ricolian-occupied lands, their worries were increased immensely. Almost every village they passed through was burned or looted, forests were logged, and fields were completely ransacked of their crops. But eventually, they would come across Azulus' large circular camp, with tall walls built out of entire tree trunks. The envoy moved closer and were eventually greeted by 4 humans on horseback. Victus was pleasantly surprised to see that at least 4 Palmer people were still alive. Once they introduced themselves, they were led inside the camp and saw Ricolians for the first time. Tall, half man, half horse, and appeared to probably have the strength of at least 2 men. They are led through a long corridor of tents, with warriors preparing their equipment for the next campaign. And in the end, they are led to a large central tent, containing Azulus himself, with his commanders and many advisors, which are of a wide variety of races, mostly of those he had just conquered. Azulus is informed of who Victus is, and gets up from a large cushion in the center of the tent. Victus walks up to him. Azulus's voice then booms in a language that Victus cannot understand. It is only when his translator, a Palmer man named Almar, translates the statement that Victus can truly hear Azulus's words for the first time. Great Azulus is convinced that the cure for death is on this side of the Great Ricolian Mountain. He knows that you and your strange religion are hiding it from him. He has united the tribes of Ricolia, like was foretold in the prophecy, and now he seeks to complete it. He demands you tell him where the cure for death is, and to tell him the positions of every eastern army before he continues searching. Victus unfortunately decided to laugh at this question. He explained to the translator that the idea of a cure for death is not only ridiculous, but the thought of it is infinitely worse than the luxuries and the pleasures of the afterlife. And to the second part, he explained that there was no way for him to know where the locations of the other nations' armies in the east were in the first place. After Almar translated it back to Azulus, Victus' arm was suddenly grabbed and his hand was swiftly cut off. Victus fell to his knees and cried out in pain before Almar translated Azulus's second statement. Azulus the Great will no longer wait while the Easterners lie to his face and disrespect him. He wants you to again point out the positions. If you don't know anything about the armies of the East, he is unsure why you are here wasting his time. Victus remained silent and writhed in pain on the ground, when suddenly Azulus tossed him a solid gold prosthetic hand. The translator informed Victus that it was compensation for his vassalization. Victus remained speechless before a new voice suddenly spoke up. One moon priest that had been brought along on the trip suddenly stepped forward. His name was Eldejon, and he stated to everyone's surprise that he actually knew where the cure for death was, which is weird because it obviously doesn't actually exist. Eldejon had apparently been scheming during this whole ordeal, and he actually had a history back home. Eldejon was one of the more fanatic priests of the moon, and he fairly openly was in favor of the church taking over the duties of state from the council. The only reason he was brought along was because Victus knew he was charismatic, and there was at least some sort of chance that Eldejon could calm Azulus down, and lead him to possibly spare them. Another reason, however, was possibly due to Victus wanting to get rid of Eldejon. He knew that Eldejon liked to run his mouth, and there was always the possibility of him speaking too much and getting himself killed by the Ricolians. Nevertheless, both of the plans backfired on Victus, because while Victus was the one lying on the ground with a brutal wound, Eldejon could speak his magic with Azulus. Eldejon continued about his knowledge of the cure for death, and it became very apparent that Azulus believed this to be real. Eldejon's intentions at this point of the story are still pretty unclear, but he is starting to set himself up for success. For the time being, whatever Eldejon tells Azulus will appear to have his nominal support. Azulus announces to the camp shortly after that the armies are to begin reorganizing and will be moving out soon. Azulus would follow Eldejon with his main army to this supposed cure for death, while his two generals continue to conquer the peoples of the east. To make it worse, Victus was left at the Ricolian camp, unguarded, but disregarded as a nobody. The apparent betrayal of Eldejon and slight by Azulus would change his life dramatically. Shortly after the armies made their move, Rickar, one of Azulus's generals, moved south into Alvonian territory, crushing everything in his path. They would move even farther south into the tribe of Enlustig, which was a part of the Eldari Council, and discovered a united Eldari-Enlustig army. The Ricolians attacked, and for the first time, the Eldari, with the help of their tribal allies, defeated the Ricolians and sent them back to their camp. The next day, however, the Ricolians repositioned their army and attacked from a different direction, catching the Eldari there off guard, and destroying it. Azulus followed Eldejon and his group of moon priests to a place called the Lone Hill, which was all the way north, less than 100 or so miles from the city of Stendari. Then, something strange happened. Eldejon made a concoction consisting of mushrooms and water, and gave it to Azulus to drink on the night of a full moon on top of the hill. The moon was perfectly in view and illuminated the land. Azulus drank it and had a spiritual journey that was really just a bunch of hallucinogenic mushrooms. There was a point where only Eldejon and Azulus were atop the hill, and there would have been many moments where Azulus was totally out of it and would have been perfect timing for him to be strucken down. but Eldajan chose not to. Azulus woke from his trip truly thinking he was now immortal, and he had found the cure for death. He was so thankful to Eldajan that he named him his vassal and lord of the Eldari people. Eldajan went one step further and had a temple constructed upon the hill. The roof of the temple had the words Lifos Lonog Azulo inscribed on it. More and more, Eldajan seemed to be laying the groundwork for some kind of sinister plan against the council. He was then ordered to take 10,000 Rokolian troops and occupy Stendari. Before he left, he warned Azulus that the kingdom of Karatolo in the southeast had become a staunch ally of the council over the past decade, and to be wary of their ability to fight. The two bid farewell. Azulus moved his forces southeast to conquer the rest of Poria, and eventually making his way down south to Karatolo. And Eldajan made his way to Stendari. During this time, Lumnar had used his time wisely. As more and more information came in about the invasion, he sent word to every nation that he could reach. Kaldari, Pialtsev, Dinyan, Prislohana, and Lahurith, to name a few. He spent his time making alliances with other counselors and began to prove himself to be an excellent politician. However, as the crisis continued, Lumnar began to slip further and further into authoritarianism. When he learned that the entire province of Landlass had suddenly surrendered to Azulus before their territory was even touched by a single Rokolian, he had all of the Palmer representatives arrested and expelled from the city. But suddenly, a knock at the door. Lumnar was informed that a Rokolian army had appeared at the gates of Stendari, but they were not in battle position and were requesting to be let in. Lumnar went to the top of the walls above the gate of the city and found not Victus but Eldajan standing there with 10,000 Rokolian. Lumnar, visibly shocked, yells down to Eldajan asking where Victus is. Eldajan replied by telling him that Victus is totally safe and is with the Rokolian king negotiating the status of the council's surrender. Lumnar did not believe him and yelled back that the council would never accept vassalization. Eldajan replied one last time, "You will have to speak with your brother about that then," and ordered the Rokolians to begin breaking down the door. Lumnar began to realize that his situation was totally dire. The Rokolians outside the city walls outnumbered his men in the city, and they couldn't be held out for long. If he risked a fight and lost, the Rokolians might take out their frustration on the populace. So Lumnar relented and ordered his men to put down their arms and open the door, before disappearing into the streets into the council house. Thousands of Rokolians then poured into the capital of the strongest empire of the world, and it became a dire and chaotic situation very fast. The Rokolians had nowhere to stay, so they began to break into people's homes. Citizens began to throw water and waste on the soldiers, which turned into small skirmishes in the street. Hit-and-run tactics began to increase, causing the fearful Rokolians to begin slaughtering civilians when they looked suspicious. All the while, Lumnar and the council had moved to a secret hiding spot in the middle of town, and began to use false identities. Eldajan, now in charge of the city, began to run it like a dictator, forcing people to convert to Moonfaith when he found non-believers, and jailing hundreds who opposed his rule. But Lumnar was still working hard in the background to change the situation. Letters from nations in the east began to inform him that they were sending armies to fight the Rokolians. It was at this time that Lumnar began to fall into heavy drinking. The deaths of hundreds were on his hands for letting the Rokolians into the city, and he fell into a deep depression, with no real end in sight. But just like that, it all changed. Eldajan is suddenly informed one morning that an army of orcs had marched south and are preparing to lay siege to the city. The orcs outnumbered the Rokolian force 2-1, and the Rokolians decided to leave the city before even ever counseling Eldajan, sensing a trap had been set up by the council. Eldajan also barely escaped with his life, being totally undiscovered until he left the city walls. The orcish army marched up to the city, and at their lead, King Ion of Kaldari and Victus Grim with a shiny golden hand. Victus had escaped the camp after defying all odds, made his way north where the Ricolian presence was scarce, and eventually all the way to Caldari, where he had many allies. The situation was explained to Ion of Caldari, and he pledged his support. Victus had come to his aid before in the battle against Thessalon, and he would now repay the favor. The situation was shared between the two brothers, and the short-lived dictatorship of Eldajon would go on to be quite the tale in Eldari history. They now had to begin to plan how to destroy Azulus and his army for good. During Lumnar's time hiding in the city, he had developed a complex system of secret alliances. With the help of pigeons, were able to communicate with each other fairly quickly. The Prizlohana, Dinyan, and Karatolo kingdoms began to coordinate their plans of attack. A different approach would be needed to be taken against the Ricolian horde. As Azulus conquered farther and farther into Poria, he would eventually reach the Karatolo border. Karatolo had been a part of the ambitious new attack plans and secret alliances with Lumnar Grim, and wanted to ambitiously set a trap. Azulus moved into the territory with 30,000 soldiers, and the Karatolo army began to hide in the woods and use hit-and-run tactics against them. Azulus had to pull his force out of the region, but not with a plan. His scouts were able to find where Karatolo's base of operation was, and turned the tables on them by attacking at night, almost entirely wiping out their entire force. After the news from Karatolo, Dinyan began to send their army out into Poria and set the same traps, dealing casualties to Ricolian patrols and garrisons in the region. But Dinyan's general wanted to end the war, and attempted to locate Azulus's exact position. His army marched a little too far out into Poria, and was discovered first. Azulus again attacked, and destroyed an allied army. Victus and Lumnar began to grow very frustrated with the situation, and decided that they needed to gamble a one-set-piece battle against Azulus. The Eldari army began to rearm, and with their Caldari allies, formed an army of roughly 30,000 men. A hill was chosen in eastern Eldari where they would attempt to lure Azulus. The remains of Dinyan's army, as well as the main army of Prizlohana, would meet them at the hill. The united force capped somewhere at around 65,000 soldiers, still vastly outnumbered by Azulus's force if it was fully united. They then sent out messages that were intentionally supposed to be discovered by the Ricolian army. The letters were meant to make the Eldari resistance sound weaker than it actually was, and were just moving past the hill, staying there for a short time. Azulus fell for the trap, united all of his forces, and marched his army to the hill. When he got there, however, he did not find a scattered and unprepared small force, but a large, well-defended, and fortified force ready to fight for their lives. But Azulus was not deterred, and decided to attack anyway. The first day saw Azulus charge his army straight up the hill, and took somewhere around 20,000 casualties before they had to retreat. A promising start for the coalition, but Azulus wasn't done. The second day, he repositioned his army to attack from multiple different directions, and after a long, bloody day of fighting, was able to force the coalition off the hill. He had taken so many casualties and fought for so long, however, that they were unable to pursue the defenders. The third day saw Azulus frustrated with the battle and wanted to deal a quick and final blow to the coalition. He committed his entire remaining force to attack all at once at the defenders' new camp, which they had spent the night refortifying. The third day was by far the bloodiest, and somewhere around 40 to 45,000 were dead in total, but mostly on the Ricolian side. The armies had now been campaigning for months without breaks, and could not fight like they once did. So many Ricolians were dying that his commanders, notably Riccar and Jacobus, mutinied from the army and brought sizable amounts of troops with them. With nothing else to do, Azulus was forced to retreat from the battlefield, and the fourth day of battle never came. This battle later came to be known as the Battle of the Four Armies, referring to the four armies who fought together as one. and the outcome had a major impact on world history. If it had gone the other way, the Eldari Council, as well as their allies, and probably many more in the region, would have been wiped out for good. This was the final engagement against the Ricolians, as Azulus lost his support in the army, eventually going all the way home to Ricolia. But the Ricolians were not entirely gone. Their occupied lands were now in the hands of a bunch of warlords, and even though the allies were victorious, their armies were destroyed and their economies were in shambles. Dealing with the remaining Ricolian presence in the area would take time. As for Eldajon, he was never heard from again after leaving Stendari. Some say he was able to rekindle his friendship with Azulus after his failure to keep Stendari under his control. Others say he was found and killed by allied armies. After their biggest test yet, the Eldari Council had avoided total destruction, and if it wasn't for the help of their neighbors, it would have been assured to happen. Sometime after the battle was won, Victus, the man who had led the Eldari Council to greatness, destroyed Thessalon and his Orcish invasion, fought off the united Porian army, and expanded his nation's influence to a never-before-seen scale, died peacefully in Stendari, leaving his brother Lumnar the de facto dictator and leader of the Eldari Council, or what was left of it. It would seem a different strategy would be needed for Lumnar to rebuild his brother's legacy. A strategy of diplomacy, alliances, and expanding the idea of the council to a level that had never before seemed reasonable.